Now this is one of the best, strongest endgame barbarian build with no uber uniques in season 3. With this build you can easily clear multiple tier 100 nightmare dungeons and destroy bosses. Now this build is so strong that you don't need any uber uniques for this build to work, and I highly recommend you to watch this video from the beginning to the end to see how everything synergizes. So let's check this out. So first I'm going to show you clearing this dungeon, and as you can see I'm doing a tier 100 nightmare dungeon. This build is so strong that it can clear multiple tier 100 nightmare dungeons, even vault nightmare dungeons. With this build you'll destroy huge groups of enemies and melt bosses. Now with this build I am using 2 core skills, which is Whirlwind and Hammer of the Ancients, and having 2 core skills will allow you to quickly swap weapons and to maximize our damage. Now this is an endgame build, so the build is gear dependent, but I'll go over some alternate gears if you're missing some gear. And with this build I did focus a little more on defense, survivability, and maxing out all my resistance, so you can easily clear tier 100 nightmare dungeons. Now this build can destroy bosses, but if you want to one-shot uber bosses doing over 300 million damage with no uber uniques, then stay tuned for our upcoming video. But I'll go over everything in more details in their dedicated sections. Okay, so next let's check out the skills. Now I am using 2 core skills. So the first core skill I'm using is Whirlwind, and this skill is good for switching weapons. You'll go through enemies and you won't waste your overpower hit. And for the arsenal selection, make sure you change it to dual wield, and be aware that switching weapons is important for this build. It will allow you to proc your overpower hits and generate you some fury. The next core skill I'm using is Hammer of the Ancients, and this is our main damage dealing skill. It'll destroy huge groups of enemies and can one-shot bosses. And for the arsenal selection, it's automatically selected to your bludgeoning weapon. The next skill I'm using is War Cry, and this skill will grant you berserking and greatly increase your damage. The next skill I'm using is Challenging Shout, and this will grant you damage reduction and increase your maximum life. And this skill is really good for defense and survivability. And next, the ultimate skill I'm using is Wrath of the Berserker, and this skill will grant you berserking, unstoppable, and greatly increase your damage. And the last skill I'm using is Charge, and this is a good movement skill and can destroy huge groups of enemies. And for the arsenal selection, make sure you change it to your slashing weapon. Next, for the weapon expertise. Now I'm using the two-handed axe expertise, and this will greatly increase your damage and critical strike chance to vulnerable enemies. Okay, so next for the Seneschal Construct. Now for my construct, I did focus on utility and getting buffs. So the first governing stone I'm using is Tempest, and this is just the construct's fastest attack. And the tuning stones I paired it with is Fortify support, which will grant you Fortify. The next tuning stone I paired it with is Resource support, which will gain you some of your primary resource. And the next tuning stone I paired it with is Efficiency support, which will increase your critical strike chance. Now the second governing stone I'm using is Flash of Adrenaline, and this will greatly increase your damage. And the tuning stones I paired it with is Safeguard support, which will grant you damage reduction. And the next tuning stone I paired it with is Tactical support, which will decrease the cooldown of the supported skill. And the next tuning stone I paired it with is Duration support, and this will increase the duration of the supported skill. So that's pretty much the setup for the construct. But if you're able to get the Evernight tuning stone, which is an uber rare, then I'll switch out Resource support for Evernight. Okay, so next let's check out the skill tree. And I do want to mention that for this skill tree, I did focus more on defense and survivability, so you can easily clear tier 100 nightmare dungeons. So starting with the basic skills, I put 1 point into lunging strike and a point into enhanced lunging strike. And you only take these skills to get to the next path. Next for the core skills, and I am taking 2 core skills. So I put 1 point into Whirlwind and a point into enhanced Whirlwind. And this skill is used for switching weapons, going through enemies, and not wasting your overpower hit. Next I put 5 points into Hammer of the Ancients, a point into enhanced Hammer of the Ancients, and a point into Furious Hammer of the Ancients. And this is our main damage dealing skill. It'll destroy huge groups of enemies and can one-shot bosses. Next for the defensive skills, I put 1 point into Challenging Shout, a point into enhanced Challenging Shout, and a point into Tactical Challenging Shout. And this skill will grant you damage reduction and increase your maximum life. So this skill is really good for defense and survivability. Then I put 1 point into Imposing Presence and 3 points into Martial Vigor, and this skill will grant you damage reduction against elites. Next I put 1 point into Outburst and 1 point into Tough as Nails, and this skill will apply bleeding damage to enemies that hit you. And when you apply bleeding damage to your enemies, you can acquire additional buffs from your other skills and equipment. Next for the brawling skills, I put a point into War Cry, a point into Enhanced War Cry, and a point into Power War Cry. And this skill will grant you berserking and greatly increase your damage. Next I put 5 points into Charge, a point into Enhanced Charge, and a point into Power Charge. And this is a really good movement skill that can destroy huge groups of enemies. Next for the weapon mastery skills, I put 3 points into Pit Fighter, and this will greatly increase your damage to close enemies, and you will gain damage reduction against distant enemies. Next I put 1 point into thick skin and 3 points into counter offensive. And this skill will greatly increase your damage if you fortify over 50% of your maximum life. Next, for the ultimate skills, I put 1 point into Wrath of the Berserker, a point into Prime Wrath of the Berserker, and a point into Supreme Wrath of the Berserker. And this skill will grant you berserking, unstoppable, and greatly increase your damage. Next, I put 3 points into Heavy Handed, 3 points into Wall Up, and 3 points into Brute Force. And these skills will greatly increase your damage when using a two-handed weapon. Next, I put 3 points into Tempered Fury and 3 points into Furious Impulse. And this skill is important because every time you swap weapons, you gain Fury. And then I put 2 points into Invigorating Fury. And this skill is really good for survivability because you will heal every time you spend 100 Fury. And last but not least, for the key passive, I put a point into Unbridled Rage. And this will greatly increase your core skills damage, but in return, it will cost more Fury. Okay, so that's the full skill tree layout for this build. Now, there are some skill points that you can change around depending on your situation. But for this skill tree, I did focus a little more on defense and survivability, so you can easily clear tier 100 nightmare dungeons. Okay, so next for the gear, and I do want to mention that this build is gear dependent if you want to easily clear tier 100 nightmare dungeons with no uber uniques. But I'll go over some alternate gear if you're missing some gear, and all the unique gears can be farmed by beating Dario. But I'm just going to quickly go over the important stats and legendary aspects, but I'll have the full build layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. So starting with the helmet, I'm using the Tusk Helm of Jorts the Mighty, and you're looking for high damage while berserking and high maximum fury stats. And the unique aspect is when you gain berserking while already berserk, you have a 58% chance to become more enraged, granting 15% increased damage, 2 fury per second, and 10% cooldown reduction. Next, for the chest piece, the stats you're looking for is total armor and 3 damage reduction stats. And the legendary aspect I have is that you gain 1.1% increased armor for 4 seconds when you deal any form of damage, stacking up to 66%. And we can easily cap out the disobedience stacks because when enemies hit you, you will apply bleeding damage to them. And when you apply bleeding damage to enemies, you will easily max out your disobedience stacks. Now, you can switch this legendary aspect for the Juggernaut legendary aspect, which will greatly increase your armor, but in return your evade's cooldown is doubled. Now, personally, I like to evade because you can dodge attacks, and depending on your boots, you can greatly increase your movement speed. So personally, I like to use the disobedience legendary aspect over the Juggernaut legendary aspect. Next, for the gloves, the stats you're looking for is attack speed, critical strike chance, lucky hit, up to a 5% chance to restore 17.3 primary resource, and ranks to Hammer of the Ancients. And the legendary aspect I have is that Hammer of the Ancients quakes outward and its damage is increased by 15%. And this legendary aspect is important for your Hammer of the Ancients to do AoE damage. Next, for the pants, you're looking for total armor and 3 damage reduction stats. And the legendary aspect I have is that each point of fury generated while at maximum fury grants 41 fortify. And these pants are really good for defense and survivability. Next, for the boots, you're looking for movement speed, berserking duration, and fury cost reduction. And the legendary aspect I have is lucky hit. Damaging an enemy with a core skill has up to a 40% chance to extend the duration of berserking by 2 seconds. Double this duration if it was a critical strike. Next, for the weapons. Now, the stats for all your weapons, you're looking for all stats, strength, overpowered damage, and damage while berserking. And for the two-handed mace, the legendary aspect I have is that each point of fury you generate while at maximum fury grants your next core skill within 5 seconds, 4% increased damage up to 60%. And this legendary aspect will greatly increase your damage. Next, for the one-handed weapons. Now, ideally, you're looking for a mace. The reason why is because its base stat has overpowered damage. And for this weapon's legendary aspect I have, skills deal up to 20% increased damage based on your available primary resource when cast, receiving the maximum benefit while you have full primary resource. The next one-handed weapon I'm using a mace, and the legendary aspect is that charge calls forth 4 ancients who also charge, dealing 30% of normal damage. And this legendary aspect will allow your charge to destroy huge groups of enemies. And next, for the two-handed slashing weapon. Now, ideally, you're looking for a two-handed axe. The reason why is that its base stats has damage to healthy enemies. And the legendary aspect I have is that after swapping weapons 8 times, your next non-basic skill will overpower and deal 100% increased overpower damage. And this legendary aspect will greatly increase your overpower damage. And with this legendary aspect, you can easily one-shot bosses. Next, for the amulet. Now, I am using the Banished Lord's Talisman unique amulet. And you're looking for high critical strike chance, high overpower damage, and high resource regeneration stats. And the unique aspect is that after you spend 300 of your primary resource, your next core skill is guaranteed to overpower. Your critical strikes that overpower deal 120% increased damage. And this unique amulet will greatly increase your damage when you critically strike your overpower hit. Next, for the rings. Now, the first ring I'm using is the Ring of Red Führer unique ring. And you're looking for high attack speed, maximum fury, and resource regeneration. And the unique aspect is that after spending 100 fury within 3 seconds, your next cast of Hammer of the Ancients, Upheaval, or Death Blow within 5 seconds is a guaranteed critical strike that deals 30% bonus critical strike damage. And this unique ring is really good for your Hammer of the Ancients to guarantee a critical strike. And the second ring I'm using is is a legendary ring. And the stats you're looking for is critical strike chance, damage while berserking, maximum fury, and resource regeneration. And the legendary aspect I have is that killing an enemy or hitting a boss with a core skill refunds 29% of its base fury cost. Can only happen once per skill cast. And this legendary aspect is important to gain fury. Now really quickly to go over some alternate gear. So first, if you don't have the Ring of Red Fury unique ring, you can definitely use another ring similar to this ring. Next, if you can't find the Tusk Helm of George the Mighty, then you can use this unique helmet, the Godslayer Crown. But ideally you want to use this helmet for one-shotting bosses. Or if you can't find a unique helmet, you can use a legendary helmet like this. And the stats you're looking for is like strength, damage while berserking, and total armor. Next, for the pants, if you can't find pure defensive pants, you can use Tybalt's Will. Now Tybalt's Will greatly increase your damage, but in return you're going to lose a lot of defense and survivability compared to using pants like this with total armor and 3 damage reduction stats. But you can still clear tier 100 nightmare dungeons with Tybalt's Will, but you have to play more carefully. And you'll see that wearing purely defensive pants like these pants, you can easily clear tier 100 nightmare dungeons due to the increased defense and survivability, reducing the likelihood of facing defeat. And last but not least, for the amulet, if you can't find the Banished Lord's Talisman unique amulet, you can use a legendary amulet like this. And you're looking for movement speed, total armor, damage reduction, and cooldown reduction. And I do want to mention that if you're easily trying to beat Uber Lilith, having high movement speed on your amulet is really important if you want to easily dodge her fireballs. Okay, so that's pretty much the full build layout to easily clear tier 100 nightmare dungeons without any Uber uniques. And like I mentioned before, I'll have the full build layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. And really quickly for the gems. Now for the armor pieces, you're looking for ruby gems to increase your maximum life. For your weapons, you're looking for ruby gems to increase your overpowered damage. And for the jewelry, to easily max out all your resistance, you want to use a diamond gem, a amethyst gem, and an emerald gem. And as you can see, with these 3 gems on my jewelry and with my Paragon board, I was easily able to cap out all my resistance. Okay, so next let's check out the Paragon board. And I do want to mention that this Paragon board is fully optimized at level 100. With this Paragon board, I did focus on getting the important legendary nodes and maxing out all my resistance. And I'm just going to quickly go over this Paragon board, but I'll have the full Paragon board layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. So starting with the starter Paragon board, I took the exploit glyph. And this glyph is important because you'll apply vulnerable to enemies and you'll greatly increase your damage to vulnerable enemies as well. The next Paragon board I took is Carnage. And the glyph I took is Eerie. And this will greatly increase your damage while berserking. And make sure you take this rare node Cold Condition to cap out your cold resistance. And for this Paragon board, I did split it into 3 directions. So first, heading left, the Paragon board I took is Blood Rage, and I also took the legendary node. And this states killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to grant berserking for 5 seconds. Your damage is increased by 25% of your damage while berserking bonus. And as you can see, my current bonus is at 77% because I am stacking a lot of damage while berserking stats. And this legendary node is really important to greatly increase your damage. And make sure you take this rare node Fire Condition to cap out your fire resistance. Then heading back to the Carnage Paragon board and then heading up this way. The next Paragon board I took is Weapon Master, and I also took the legendary node, which states swapping weapons grants you 4% of your maximum fury. And because you are swapping weapons a lot, this will make you regain fury quickly. And make sure you take this legendary node Lightning Condition to cap out your lightning resistance. Then heading back to the Carnage legendary board and then going right this way. And the next Paragon board I took is Decimator, and the glyph I'm using is Crusher, and this will greatly increase your overpowered damage while wielding a mace. I also took the legendary node Decimator, and this will greatly increase your damage when overpowering vulnerable enemies. Then I headed down this way, and the last Paragon board I took is Warbringer, and the glyph I'm using is Might, and this will greatly increase your damage while wielding 2-handed weapons. And I also took the legendary node Warbringer, and this will grant you Fortify for every 75 fury you spend. Okay, so that's pretty much a fully optimized Paragon board at level 100. And with this Paragon board, you should do huge damage, you should easily regain your fury, you should have really good defense and survivability, and you can easily cap out all your resistance. And like I mentioned before, I'll have the full Paragon board layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Okay, so thanks for checking out one of the best, strongest endgame barbarian build with no uber uniques in season 3. With this build, you should easily clear multiple tier 100 nightmare dungeons and destroy bosses. And with this build, you don't need any uber uniques for this build to work. And I'll have a one-shot uber Daryl and uber Lilith build guide in the future, so stay tuned. And definitely check out these videos if you're looking for a strong and fast leveling build for your barbarian. Hope this helps in more Diablo 4 videos to come. And of course,